You're listening to Perspective on Manx Radio. We're talking about the study of modern foreign languages on the Isle of Man, or rather maybe the lack of. It's at an all-time low, as revealed in a Freedom of Information request recently. We've got another guest joining us for this half of the programme, Annie Kissack. Fast am I, Annie?
Fast am I.
And now your view on language learning is maybe quite a different one to everything we've heard in the first hour. You teach at the Bunscoill. Now tell us a bit about what that entails.
Yes, that's right. I've been teaching at the Bunscoill for quite a few years now, and I teach the older children, the year 5 and 6. So it's quite interesting seeing how the children progress through the school till they reach 10 and 11 and see the pattern of language. One of the things I think's most important for being successful in this is actually having a feeling of confidence and not being afraid to make mistakes. And that really, I think that's the advantage of the sort of immersion education we have at the Bunscoill. Children start speaking Manx or being talked to in Manx through Manx from 4. And there's not really any concession to explaining this in English again. And very, very quickly, they do adjust to this. And, you know, if they don't quite understand anything, well, they'll take other cues. And there's a culture of perhaps not being afraid of making a mistake. And I think that gives that real sort of layer of confidence that everybody needs in order to launch off into an unfamiliar language. It gives me confidence too. Mm-hmm. I'm not a natural linguist in any way, or one of these people who would have picked up 3 A levels in language at high school at all. But I think because we're in an environment where everybody's sort of in the same boat, we're all sort of learners, even the teachers. It gives you that more confidence to go a bit further, and I think it's a good sound start really for perhaps continuing with languages in later years at secondary school.
Ironically, the word for teacher and learner in Manx is the same, is it not? But
yes.
Just to talk a bit about immersion schooling then, for people who don't know, everything is done in Manx really at the Bunscoill, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. Certainly all through the infant years, if you like, using the old jargon, Key Stage 1, most of Key Stage 2. So maths, science, that's a challenge, but we're getting there. History, anything that you would learn in any normal, if you like, primary school, we do through Manx, except for we do start teaching English in the Key Stage 2, and that's, say, a morning a week, and we do in English all sorts of things which you couldn't really do in Manx, the novels and the longer poetry and this sort of thing. So it's a different proportion of things, but a vast majority of everything goes through Manx, yes.
Something which was spoken about at the Ned Madrill lecture at the back end of last year, and we had Bunscoill Ghaelgagh over, who's a kind of a specialist in immersion in Irish Gaelic, and he spoke a bit about the different patterns and paces of learning when you're learning in an immersion school. Tell us a bit about that, I suppose. I mean, kids obviously, I would imagine, take a couple of years to get up to grips with their Manx first, maybe, before learning more.
It's interesting. I mean, I'm quite surprised at the pace at which some children, but not all children, will pick up sort of receptive language and understand basically most of what you're saying and doing within a term or two. And other children will take longer to start using it themselves, and that reflects all sorts of things, the personality, the background, whether they've got any support from home. If they're a more confident child, there's lots of variety within that. But certainly in terms of dealing with the day-to-day demands of being in a school, it doesn't seem to present problems for children at all. And it's certainly in reception year, by the end of reception, you have children who are quite happily learning through the language, even if they are expressing themselves sort of half and half, or perhaps mainly in English at that point. Some do actually sort of internalise what's going on and start launching off into more Manx than others. And that increases as you go through the school. But it does vary from child to child, undoubtedly.
I'm curious to know what happens about playtime. Do children keep up with the Manx, or is there more kind of English comes in maybe there?
More English, of course, and I suppose it is an effort. using Manx all the time until this becomes very familiar. So in a way, it's a bit of downtime. But we're doing certain children will use a little more Manx than others, and there are things you can do, like if you're trying to introduce various playground games and this sort of thing, and some of them will carry on using them. Some of the older children, I suppose, almost take on a role of being teacher outside to the younger ones, and will carry on those ones who are concerned about these things. But it is true that, and I think this is true in all Gaelic and other immersion settings generally, that it is quite difficult when English is the dominant language there to sort of totally override it, and really there's quite a challenge to how you can keep Manx or Gaelic going outside of the taught school language. And I know that's a wide problem with all languages, and we still haven't really got the answer to that yet, but we're always trying to think of things and keep going.
And in terms of when children leave your class then and move to secondary school, as things stand, obviously as a disclaimer, there's no kind of immersion schooling at secondary level. Do you find maybe children keep their Manx as they get older?
It's very varied. I think generally well, our children go to a variety of secondary schools, so they don't all go to a school where there will necessarily be provision for Manx. Some do, and some do continue learning a couple of lessons through Manx for the first few years. Others don't, or may just meet up occasionally with other children if parents arrange it. In terms of whether they want to and if they continue using the language, I think around about 12, 13, it's fairly common they get very embarrassed by it and want that sort of wanting to fit in and be like everybody else. And then we often find that children perhaps at A level will pop out of the woodwork and suddenly profess a great interest and very quickly sort of retrace their steps, and we find that what they had learnt initially had stayed there. They might have thought it had gone and will come out later, or even later, early 20s. And so interesting pattern. Not everybody's the same, but there's certainly a reasonable number of people who do return to the language in some form or other in later life.
I was, I think, just a bit too old to go to the Bunscoill. May well have done had it been there then, but it's been around long enough now, I suppose, that you can begin to plot what happens to people post-study there.
Yes, we need to do that in a more systematic way. I mean, we have lots of sort of anecdotal stories, and we do sometimes have parents or ex-pupils themselves who will say, this is what we're doing now. And we certainly do have people who are still using Manx. Others have gone on to take degrees in other languages, for example, French. Certainly, some people have... Well, at least a couple of people I know who've got into, or certainly been applied to the likes of Oxford or Cambridge, and actually having that sort of Manx dimension has made them stand out and give them a sort of advantage, even if they weren't particularly studying Celtic studies as such. Yeah, so it's quite interesting, but we do need to perhaps start gathering that information more systematically now we've got greater numbers going through.